Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Like I said, my name is Paul Rada. I don't want to give also too long of a bio. And as far as like my experience with toxic stress and trauma, my wife and I were from Kansas City, and we have 7 children, so that might be something, have something to contribute to it. When I was a kid, my family came to this country from the Philippines, my father's side, and the first stop was like the south side of Chicago. And we shared a 1-bedroom apartment with another family from another country. Nobody spoke English on either side except me, and I was too young to be much of a translator. And we saw a lot of rough things. One day, I was leaving our building. A lot of homeless folks were living on the block around where we live. And there's a man sleeping in our doorway. And so as I walked out, I stepped over him, and my grandfather's with me, and he said, and I said this, I said, "I wish this bum would get out of my way." My grandfather abruptly, not so gently, snatched me around and said, "Do you see this gentleman here? That's not a bum. That's your neighbor." So I do appreciate Leah introduced me as your neighbor. He took me upstairs, and he got me a pen and a pad, and he said, "Your assignment for the summer is that you're going to interview every single homeless person living on our block. When you finish there, you're going to go to the next block and the next block." So that summer, I spent interviewing people that were homeless. I was probably about 8, 9 years old. I can't imagine sending an 8 or 9-year-old out in the streets of Chicago to do that now. But what I found were some very interesting things. I found people who had been professionals, from attorneys to medical professionals. I've met people who said they chose to be out there. My backpack was stolen, and a few other things. But one thing that I found that was very significant was that everybody has a story, and that's what I learned. Everyone had a story. And to this day, I attribute, amongst my best teachers, instructors, professors, were those people that I met that summer, because it changed the way I view things in life. So today, my background, other than that, I'm a clinical nurse educator. I cover multiple campuses in Kansas City, and I have implemented a trauma-informed philosophy into the way we do things. And the outcomes have been pretty incredible since that time. And today, I'm going to talk about some various things. Some things might be a little triggering. So if you're triggered by anything I say today, first of all, I do apologize, and I also want you to make sure you do take care of yourselves. Very, very important. So there's questions here that Leah pointed out on your paper. You can write if you have questions you'd rather not air on the open. Like I said, this is 3 days usually of training condensed into about an hour and a half. And I'm glad that they put a clock on the wall, because generally when there's not a clock, I'll just go on and on and on. So trauma-informed care. Bridging the gap between the head and the heart, or balancing it. That's what I always like to say, having some kind of balance between there. Everybody can see the screen okay? Okay. Here are the objectives. I'm not going to go through all of those today. We'll get to that each topic here. All right, Dorothy. First impressions when you see this face. Grumpy, unapproachable. Anybody know anybody who just looked like they had lemons for breakfast? Just kind of that sour face. How important would you say, like a unit clerk or an administrative assistant, is to the places where you work? Very important. Is it almost like the heartbeat, keeps everything together for you? Well, Dorothy here is one of such one of those folks that I know. That's not her actual name. But Dorothy was a unit clerk, still is. And when I would work with her, and everyone's known it, don't look to the left or the right, but we all have been in a position where we've shown up at work, and we've looked on the schedule, and we saw that name, and we go, oh no, it's going to be a long day. So Dorothy, being our unit clerk, I would go to hand paperwork to her to be filed sometimes, and generally the approach was, I'd walk up, good morning, Dorothy. I have these, what do you want? I'm like, oh my gosh. And could you mind filing these papers? Oh God. And that was usually a response. And like this sour look on her face, and that's not her actually. I want to repoint that out. But hard to approach. When you work with someone like that in your workplace, what does that do to the flow of your day? This is interactive, so speak up. Does it help it? Does it hurt it? No. Do I want to go and ask her to do anything for me? No. Gosh. And so, as what usually happens at work, they had a meeting when I was gone, and when I came back, I was elected to go talk to Dorothy about this situation. Yeah. Which, gosh, who knows what's going to happen, what I have on my plate when I get back. So I said, well, thank you, everyone, for entrusting me with this, very sarcastically. So I decided, and this, I'm summing it up, but it took a couple of weeks when I was talking to Dorothy. But I remember walking up to her, same kind of thing, what do you want? Kind of look at me. I said, well, Dorothy, I just want to ask you a question. You just don't seem too happy here. And she goes, what do you mean? I'm happy. I'm like, okay. I said, well, you just don't seem like you like us too much. And she goes, that's ridiculous. And so we started talking, and I said, have I or anyone else offended you somehow? Because in the whole time in my head, I'm going, how did she make it through an interview process? I'm like, what are our policies? What kind of questions are being asked? And so I'm digging in deep with Dorothy, and we're talking, and it starts fleshing out. And I said, and saying, you don't seem very happy here, and you just seem to be upset with us a lot. What's happened? And then she looked at me, and she said, I love my job. And I'm like, huh? I'm like, how's that? I love my job. I love working with all you amazing people. I'm like, I'm looking for a camera at this point going, okay, someone's playing a joke on me. And because I said, well, Dorothy, you got this weird, odd way of expressing it. Is there something I'm missing, with that? So we're diving in deeper in this, and again, just taking a couple of weeks. And she said, I go home every day. On my way home, I stop at the store. I buy a couple of pints of ice cream. I go home. I sit in front of the television. I just sit there and I eat it because I can't wait to fall asleep. Because the only thing I have to look forward to in life is coming here to work with you amazing people. And still, I'm like taken aback, like someone's messing with me. But as I start learning Dorothy's story, and she starts telling me more of what's going on. First, she tells me she's one of 10 children. Okay. Her parents were much older when she was born. She's the middle child. Are things starting to unravel for you here a little bit? And then she tells me that when she was about 9 or 10 years old, her father and then one of her uncles sexually assaulted her. She had never shared that with anybody, and she said that since that time, if I start getting close to anyone, I just build these walls up around me. And it just comes out as anger. And that's how I respond to people. And I'm sorry. What about James here? What do you see in this picture? What comes to mind first? Homeless? Sad? Okay. Defeated? Right? And I also see my neighbor here also. There's a term in the hospital that we're not supposed to use, and I'm sure it relates to some of you all here too. Have you ever heard of the term frequent flyer? Someone coming to try to get services just for whatever reason. Maybe you don't even think they need it or deserve it. They just keep coming back and back over and over again. Well, James here, our neighbor, we have, anyone been lucky enough to go to the ER before? I say lucky. You're triaged, okay, when you come in here. So this gentleman, James, well known throughout all the hospitals, he would walk in, and every day was the same kind of thing. He'd walk in, and he'd walk up to the desk, and he'd slam his hand on the desk, say, "Food and medicine." "Sir, if you could just have a seat." "Food, medicine." Over and over and over. "Well, sir, we have real patients." "Food, medicine, food." And it would go on and on and on and on. Could you see how that would disrupt the ER? What's going on? We have multiple traumas coming in, and I'm one of the ones who are guilty in the back saying, "Get on some food and medicine." And I probably added a color metaphor. I don't know. And because we have all this going on. And so this has been years and years and years what's happening here until finally we decided to say we need to ask, get some help from social work and some case managers. We have case managers here? Social workers? I share an office with a social worker, so I got to be really careful. Let's ask, what is his story? What happened to James? So they did a lot of digging around. It is not easy to find history on someone who's been homeless for that as long as he has. He's in his mid-60s or so at this point. So James, we find that when he was just a toddler, I have a hard time with the story sometimes. His mother took him by his ankles, slammed him against the wall multiple times. And obviously it damaged his hearing. Now we know why he's yelling, food and medicine. He's taken away from his mother and placed into a placement custody. And up until then, at 7 years old, he's in front of a judge for placement. I guess we always go to court for placement. And the judge declares him unadoptable. Had you ever heard that term before? Unadoptable? It's the first time I had ever. What does that say to you? If you're declared unadoptable, if you can imagine a 7-year-old kid staring up at the judge and he's declared unadoptable. It's like saying you're worthless, you're not worth anything. So he's taken and put in a state institution and up until he's 18 years old. And during that time, he's physically abused and sexually abused, not just by peers, but also by staff. 18 years old, he's released on the streets. They give him a sack lunch, 2 weeks worth of medication, said, "We can't do anything else for you. If you need anything, you have to go find a social worker on your own." And so since that time, my neighbor had been living on the streets. And is there violence in homelessness? Yeah, there's so many stories that we don't know that's happened to James. And when he's feeling bad, when he can't find somewhere to go, he knows he can go to a hospital, and there he is with food and medicine. And we wanted to find out what his story was. Trauma-informed care, and I'll touch on this later also, is very much about saying what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. Has anyone ever been asked that question? What's wrong with you? What does it imply? Yeah, that's your fault. There's something wrong with you. I thought my name was Damn It for a long time. Damn it, Paul? What's wrong with you? But when you ask what happened to you, it changes. It shows that you're invested. You want to know their story behind what's happening. Now, trauma covers a lot of areas. You know, what do you think of when you just hear the word trauma? Injury, severe. And what about on the emotional side? We normally think of what? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, and those other types of things. Trauma happens when your internal and your external resources can no longer cope with what's happening right now. And that's when they say trauma occurs. It's an event or actual experience. It could be threat, could be whatever's perceived, withholding material like food, people being neglected. It could be a single event, or it could be something that happens over and over and over again. You have two soldiers go off to war, and they see the exact same thing, they experience the exact same thing. They come back, one has PTSD, and the other one seems relatively unaffected. Why is that? Experience, when we talk about trauma and toxic stress, it's how someone assigns meaning to an event. We assign meaning to all different kinds of things. Do you guys read charts here? Like, do you chart clinical notes on your clients and all of that? It's when things are objectively written, when we are talking about people, even in the reports we write, it changes by our meaning. If I have actually read reports that says client acting like a jerk today. Generally not a good thing to chart. But going beyond that, what is the meaning? Maybe what's a jerk to me is not a jerk to somebody else. So it's just about describing what exactly happened that day and what happened. The effects of toxic stress and trauma, that's what results from how the person responds to this effect. It could be neurological, cognitive, and obviously emotional. Toxic stress. Generally, this term and trauma are very interchangeable. The trauma occurs from prolonged exposure to stress experiences, and they're usually particularly in childhood where this takes place, where it alters the architecture, the brain chemistry even. The young mind, up to about 10 years old, the brain is very elastic and malleable. And these experiences, as we'll discuss later, they affect the actual physical structure of a child's brain. Anyone heard of the ACEs study? ACEs study is or adverse childhood events. This was a study done by Kaiser Permanent. I can never say that last word, but it's Kaiser Insurance Company. And they asked a series of questions, about 10 questions, and it's all about adverse events in childhood. It could be, have your parents been divorced? Where did you grow up? Was there any abuse involved in your home? Things like that. There's 10 questions, and they scale it. And what they're finding, and it's for this adverse childhood experiences, it just keeps adding up. If they experience the adverse childhood event, it can lead to disrupted neurological development. Then you go into social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of health, risk behaviors, and leading all up to disease and eventually an early death. And what they have been finding is that people with mental illness, this type of toxic stress, the people who have grown up in abusive homes, are dying on average 25 years younger than the rest of us. And why is that? In the next segment, we'll dive more into it. But these things, and you would not think where this survey took place was not in inner city. It wasn't in low-income areas. They did this survey about 17,000 people, and it was in a neighborhood with a suburban neighborhood with a white picket fence type area, predominantly Caucasian folks, college educated, all that, a dog and a half and a child and a half. I don't know where they come up with those stats, how you get a half a dog and a half a child. But they come up with these stats, and they surveyed these 17,000 people, And a vast majority of them had experienced at least one or more traumas. And as you move up the scale in these traumas, they follow this group, and your risk behaviors get amplified at that point. On the ACE study, people who had a 0 score on their ACE study, 1 in 16 became smokers, 1 in 69 were alcoholic. And you go on down to 1 in 480 are IV drug users. As you go across this scale here, someone who had an ACE score of 1 to 3, 1 in 9 were smokers. And you drop down to things like, 1 in 43 ended up using IV drugs, 1 in 9 alcoholic. Those who scored with an ACE score of 7 or higher, 1 in 6 were smokers, 1 in 6 were alcoholic, 1 in 30 were IV drug users, and 1 in 6 ended up with heart disease, 1 in 5 attempted suicide. So just from these 10 questions, what they had found in following this 17,000 individuals, this group, was the higher their ACE score was, it resulted in risk behaviors. My ACE score, when I took this test, when I was a kid, I was left with some individuals that, did things that shouldn't be done to a child. And I grew up in a neighborhood where often, this was the norm. That you'd walk to school and, the kids would compare, like, oh, did you get beat up, last night? How much did you get beat? And it became some kind of badge of honor. And one such kid I used to walk to school with, I remember he would always talk about the boyfriend, getting him good last night. One day when we were walking, he didn't show up. Next day he wasn't there again. So when we went to go check on him, saw the yellow tape across his door. And just at that point, I guess it was just one too many of these. And the boyfriend had ended up killing my friend. Growing up in those environments, these ACE scores, my ACE score, I scored it a 7. So for all intents and purposes, I should be, taking IV drugs and have heart disease. I am out of shape, but, I don't smoke. And why is that? And it's because I had protective factors. I had a 5'1", well, that's generous, maybe a 4'9" Filipino grandmother who, would whack me on the back of the neck every time I started heading in the wrong direction of town. She'd sit there and hide behind pillars, and I'd walk out. And if I went to the left, that was where I wasn't supposed to be. To the right, that was headed the right direction. So if I turned, all of a sudden, I don't know, from behind the bushes, whack. I don't endorse whacking by any means. But she would get me, and she was a protective factor. So, I play a video here. Not all abuses come in the form of hitting or sexual abuse. Sometimes they come in other forms.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Sitting there, and the baby was there with mom, and they're interacting, and the baby's laughing. She's pointing in a different direction, and mom is engaging and looking and interacting with the baby. They're communicating with each other. And then what they asked this mother to do was just turn away for a moment and then turn back towards her child and just have a flat affect. Just stare at the baby. No response. Don't respond to anything the baby does. Just staring at the child. It's a very uncomfortable thing to watch. And what happened was the baby started, immediately noticed something's wrong. She was like, "What? What's happening here? This is not normal. We usually have some interaction." And then within 20, 30 seconds, the baby becomes very upset and crying and all of this. And the mom is still just standing there staring at the child. And then interacts again, and they go back to the normal thing of play. So neglect often can come in the form of just ignoring, the child. Ignoring your partner, ignoring your coworkers, your teammates, acting as if they're not there. How does trauma-informed care work? It's different for everybody, but it is a practice that is responsive rather than reactive. You know anyone who reacts rather than responds? You know what I mean by that? Just reacts right away to trauma or even hearing trauma. Do you guys hear some rough stories? I was with one of our staff members who was admitting somebody, and she told this terrible story, and she said, this happened to me. And the nurse was like, "Oh my gosh! What? I can't believe that happened to you. Tell me that again. That really happened to you?" And I'm sitting there going, "Wow." Broadcasting everything to everybody. And the patient, I literally saw them go, never mind. I don't want to talk about it. The whole term of think before we speak is really basically what this is. Thinking about that. Do you guys know what universal precautions are? You ever heard that term? Why would I put on some gloves to draw someone's blood? Protection? You guys are... I can't hear very well. Protection, you said? Yeah, I don't know what they have. So generally in healthcare, we have this practice of universal precautions where we just assume everyone possibly has a disease, a communicable disease, and we need to protect ourselves and protect the patient. Trauma-informed care is much the same way that we don't make the assumption, but we think that they could have gone through some experience, and maybe it could explain their reactions to things. And so what this does when we take a trauma-informed care model and give it to our team to use, it allows our clients, our patients, whatever, the opportunity to build on a relationship, that you are here saying, I'm here to want to build a relationship with you and understand what you've been through and try to support you. When I was covering for the triage area once, which I don't normally do, an ambulance driver, paramedic came in, and they dropped off a young man for our psychiatric unit. And when he dropped him off, this just happened about a month ago, he said, good luck with this one. I was like, okay. And then he went on and said, this guy's nuts. Young man, maybe 18, 19 years old. Now, my initial reaction, which I wanted to react, was to get on my soapbox and say, have you heard of the ACEs study and blah, 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 and give him the whole rundown. But I had to make a decision, how do I respond to this rather than react? And so my response to him, I said, well, yeah, that must be hard. And the guy looked at me like, okay. And I said, could you imagine his family, his friends? Young man, have all this, big plans ahead of him, and he has a psychiatric breakdown. And I'm just thankful that you were there to help him and bring him to us so that maybe we can get him some help that he needs. And so the guy was like, okay. And he left. So about an hour later, I get called to the front. They said, there's a paramedic here looking for you. And I said, well, that's odd. I went up there, and it was the same gentleman. And he said to me, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said about that person earlier. I'm like, what do you mean? I also don't endorse lying, but I obviously a lie. I said, what do you mean? Let's just admit it. We've all lied about something. Like, I'm here. I'm going to say, Oklahoma barbecue is better than Kansas City. Not. But I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I said some pretty negative things about that person, earlier, and I just wanted to apologize. And so, again, I said, aha, now I can give him some education. I said, no, I better not do that. I just said, hey, you know what? I don't remember that, but, I just want to thank you for coming back here and just referring to him as a person. So many people don't even refer to him as people anymore. And so he left, and I haven't seen him since. But if I had given him a lecture, do you think that would have helped? It might have made me feel better, but it gave him something to think about. It's a response rather than a reaction. In a nutshell, trauma-informed care is so much about seeing people and situations through a completely different lens. This picture here, it's all blurry, but when you put the proper lens up, you see the clarity there, that everyone has a story. Do you remember our lemon-eating friend, Dorothy? Gosh, I almost said her real name. But she gives me permission to tell her story, and so does Jan. So what has happened to Dorothy at this point? Now, Dorothy has actually won Employee of the Month and Year twice in the past 5 years. You'll never meet a nicer person. We got her the help she needed. She wanted to be listened to. She wanted to be affirmed. She wanted to have some gratitude. And we had to, in trauma-informed care was a way, this philosophy is to provide her with the avenue of saying, hey, what's happened to you? Instead of what's wrong with you. It changes the way we view things. It changes the way we view people. Do you think my lens and how I viewed people changed when I interviewed all these homeless folks? It changed completely when you know someone's story, when you know what's happened to them. James, if you remember James, our fellow was homeless, coming in, smacking the table. Food, medicine, the whole time. What's happened to him since then? James has his own place for the first time in his life. From 18 years old all the way up to his mid-60s. And I've told this story several times, and about a year ago, we all received this email, those of us who were involved in his care, and it just said 2 words. It wasn't food and medicine, and it wasn't thank you even. It just said 2 things. It said, James smiled. That was the end of the email. And we all know what that meant. And I get choked up when I think about that, just the idea. No one had seen him smile to that point. So it meant everything to us that he smiled. We were able to get him his what he needed. We were able to find out what his story was. We're gonna take a quick break here in a second. But I have one more, because I always have one more story. When I was 18 years old, it was my first job my first real job out of high school. I had been I call it a biscuit technician, but they said it was Mrs. Winter's Chicken and Biscuits, and that's where I was working. And it was my first job out of high school that I went and I worked in a hospital, and it was an emergency department. First week off orientation, and I'm an orderly, which that they don't even have orderlies anymore. That tells you how old I am now. And I'm stocking supplies, and in the middle of this, there's this melee goes on. Someone grabs me. This masked man grabs me. It was a doctor or a nurse. It wasn't a robber. And puts a gauze on my hand, drags me into a little room, and says, "Put some pressure here. I'll be right back." And I'm like, "What?" So I'm putting pressure on this wound, and I don't want to look at the patient. I'm like looking this way because I don't know what's happening here. And I started hearing this grunting, like, oh, and I didn't realize I'm like really pressing hard. And so I turn around and I look at the patient, and I'm shocked again to find it's like a little girl who's about 9, 10 years old. And she looked at me, and she said to me something I'll never forget. She said, "Why did my mommy stab me?" How do you respond to that? In my head, I'm screaming, "I just graduated high school. I was just making biscuits 2 weeks ago." Pretty good biscuits, actually. But how do I answer that question? So I just answered honestly. I said, "I don't know. But you're safe now, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay safe while you're here." And then about 10 seconds after that, she didn't respond. She's just looking at me, and she had this look of relief on her face. They grabbed me and dragged me off somewhere else. It was a superficial wound. Mom stabbed her with a screwdriver. Still stabbed nonetheless. My response, what happens to the things we say? Do the things we say matter? Sometimes we don't know. But a few years ago, I got this phone call from a nurse who still works in that same ER. And she said, "You'll never guess who's here." And I said, "Well, no, I couldn't possibly." And she said, "Do you remember that little girl who was stabbed years and years and years ago?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "She's back." And I'm like, thinking the worst. I said, "Well, now that you violated HIPAA and everything else, you might as well go ahead and finish telling me why is she there?" And she goes, "Well, I'm not violating HIPAA." And I said, "Okay." I said, "We might have to have some education on that." And she goes, "No, she's here because it's her first day of her nursing clinicals." And she said that since she was a kid, she always wanted to go back and work in the only place where she felt safe and that she could do a job to make other people feel the same way. So when we think about trauma-informed care, if I had to throw it all in a nutshell, it's so much about responding rather than reacting. It's so much about making connections. And again, we'll talk more about that later. It's so much about this interface. Is it Theresa? Mm-hmm. Theresa. I guess you're on camera now. Theresa. It's about that one-to-one interaction, letting people know that you are there and you're invested in them, and you care about their story and what's happened. So, we're going to break time. Does anybody have any questions, though, over that? That was pretty quick and a lot of stories. Yes? James.
Did he ever experience incarceration in the process?
We couldn't find any records of him being incarcerated. which is amazing, consider that he had a long track record of going to different businesses even, and just saying food, medicine, until he figured out that's where he can go to a hospital. But we couldn't find any records of that, so I'm assuming no, because that might have made things easier to track him down even if he had. I'm glad that he wasn't. But no, not. But even in our prison systems, they are starting to incorporate trauma-informed care with things. Patients. There's people in the prisons who now are coming out with like Alzheimer's disease and all of that, and so they are partnering like another inmate and charging them to care for that person who's in their end-stage Alzheimer's. They teach them, they train them, and there's this transformation, that happens to the incarcerated person who's caring for the other individual now. So even on that level, they're starting to see the merits of that. But that's a long answer to no, I don't think so. But,